Good evening, everyone. I'm John Dankosky. I am the host of Steady Habits with the Connecticut Mirror, and I also work with the Connecticut Mirror on events like this one. I'm very excited for our conversation tonight. It's called Black Futures in Connecticut, a conversation with the movement for Black Lives. I want to say a few things about our program before I introduce our panelists. Our Zoom broadcasts are always recorded for YouTube, and they're available on our website, ctmirror.org/events, and you can watch them afterward. And we always encourage you to share these conversations widely. If you want to take part in this conversation, there's a few ways you can do it. I know a lot of you have probably been in a lot of Zoom calls over the course of the last year or so, but I will remind you that at the bottom of the screen, there's a chat function. And if you want to chat to the panelists or the other attendees, you can select panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're chatting about. We'll be saving these ideas for future conversations. If you want to specifically ask a question of our panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. We've got a lot to talk about tonight. I do want to say that the Graustein Fund has been so generous to us in the past. They've supported the Connecticut Mirror in a variety of ways, and we're very happy to be holding this conversation in partnership with them. Our panelists tonight include David Addams, who's Executive Director of the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund. David, welcome to our program. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
I also want to welcome Karissa Lewis, who is the National Field Director for the Movement for Black Lives. We're going to be learning a lot more about her work and the work that the movement does across the nation. Karissa, welcome to our show. Thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And Camelle Scott is the director of CT Core Organize Now. She's been organizing in Connecticut for the past decade or so, and we're very pleased to have her here to talk about some of the work she's doing on the ground in Connecticut. Camelle, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I also want to let everyone know that we do have ASL interpreters for this evening. That's something that you'll be able to see throughout the course of the evening as well. We've got a nice tight hour here to have our conversation. So let's actually get started. Today, in the Connecticut Mirror's Viewpoint section, we published an op-ed from the Graustein Fund, and it's titled, "Why a Connecticut Family Foundation is Funding the National Movement for Black Lives." It is something that drew our attention, David, and so I'll go to you first. This idea that Graustein would want to invest so heavily in this national movement, maybe you can explain a little bit what's behind this.
Certainly. So, I want to start by saying it's actually a privilege and an honor for us to be able to support this movement, to have the moment in history, to have this context provided, because one of the things we know is that, real social change happens through organizing and mass movements of people expressing their will for change. And so the fact that this movement has arisen over these last few years really provided the opportunity to support the kind of work that we've been trying to focus on here in Connecticut. We adopted an equity-focused mission 5.5 years ago. And part of what we understand is that even though we're very much focused on education, both as a process and a system, that you cannot address equity issues within a system in isolation, and that there has to be an understanding of what's going on in the ecosystem. And so when the Movement for Black Lives announced their campaign last year and articulated the desire that funders support them as if we want them to win, because that's really what this is about. And to make it not just a token kind of support, because it would be easy to just throw a little something into the hat, but we really spent some time to really think about what would make a difference and what would actually help provide context for the people we're supporting here locally in Connecticut as well, like CT Core, who are on the ground and helping to build this movement in the state of Connecticut as well.
But there is that question that you address in the piece that you published. So much of your work is centered in Connecticut. So much of the funding that you've made is directly to Connecticut. So this idea of funding a national movement somewhat goes against the grain. And I'm quite sure a lot of other people in the philanthropic world in the state are asking about this. And maybe you can talk more about that, about why this helps people directly in Connecticut that you do want to support.
Certainly. The conversation, both whether you're going to have a conversation about equity, but also the quality of that conversation is really impacted by a variety of factors. And honestly, the Black Lives Matter movement has changed the context, has changed the environment within which these conversations are happening, and frankly has made it such that it's happening more and more. And so, Connecticut, which has a rich legacy of inequity, of inequality, of segregation, was not going to be able to address those issues on its own, as much as we have people working, on various fronts. And so it was really, I think, necessary to acknowledge the value and the benefit of having this national movement happening, and how that was going to help set a tone and create a context for the work that's being done right here in the state.
So, Karissa, let me go to you. Talk about the work that Movement for Black Lives is doing across America right now. We'll be talking more specifically about what's happening on the ground here in Connecticut, dealing with some of the very specific issues that David's already addressed that we have here in our state. But talk broadly about what the movement is doing across America.
Thank you. So again, pleasure to be on the call with y'all. And I use she and her pronouns. So thank y'all for having me. So the Movement for Black Lives is an ecosystem of over 100 Black-led and centered organizations that are fighting for the rights, dignity, and power for Black folks. We were born out of the uprisings in Ferguson when Black leaders and organizers and strategists came together to really wrestle with this question: what is more possible for us to do together than it is apart? And so although we have gotten our start really responding to police violence and terror, our work spans a gamut of issues. And so, last year as the uprising unfolded, we were very clear, as well as, our member organizations on the ground in Minneapolis and across the country, that there was a real opportunity here for us to call to question the role of policing and not just individual police officers, which is often what happens when a police officer is found harming someone in our community, right? We're like, let's arrest that police officer. Let's, fire that police officer. And really, if you look at the history and trajectory of policing, it's past time for us to look at the role of policing in our communities. And so we immediately launched a campaign around defund, both in terms of narrative and supporting our local organizations to advance that work. And so that's some of the work that we continue to do. As well as, we created model legislation. It's called the Breathe Act. We also have stuff that's like connected to climate. We're going to be launching the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, which is a response to the Green New Deal that is thinking specifically about the impacts of climate and Black folks. We've done some electoral work. So we do quite a bit, and all of it is led by grassroots organizations on the ground in communities all over the country who want to come together to flex our collective muscle.
And we'll dig into some of those specific things in just a bit, but maybe I can come back to one of the key things that you're talking about here, this idea of calling into question the very role of the police. It really is a bit different than the dialogue that we often have in America, even during the uprisings of last year, even during the deep conversations that we've had about policing in America. We still tend to, I think, have a conversation about good cops and bad cops and how we should punish those who do the wrong thing. You're talking about something different.
Yeah, oftentimes people, I have two cousins who are police officers, where my father is from in Washington, D.C. And oftentimes people want to say, I know somebody who's a police officer, he's not, or they're not a bad person. And my response is, I actually don't need to talk about individuals. We have to talk about the institution that creates the conditions where folks are able to commit harm to our people unchecked, right? And where we've created the conditions where we have militarized forces in our communities. And, if you look at the face of it, Police are entwined into so much of our working life that's actually it's not necessary. Why do I need to call the police if I need to get an insurance claim? Right? Like that is an example of the scale and scope at which police are relied on that actually doesn't have to do with our safety. And when we're talking about the issue specifically around safety, what we know is that police officers often don't keep us safe, right? They are coming after a crime has already been committed, and they're coming to take notes on the crime, you know, and are supposed to do some work to hold the people accountable. But what we know is that there are other avenues that we can be utilizing that actually deters crime, that keeps our folks safer, and that is not reliant on police.
Mm. Well, as I say, there's a lot more to talk about there. But before we get into some of that, though, Camelle, maybe we can talk a bit about how this work that's being funded by Graustein, that is working specifically with the movement for Black Lives, how then that moves down to what you're doing on the ground in Connecticut. Explain, first of all, maybe a bit of the work that CT Corps is doing.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what part of that I want to tackle first. So just to kind of explain what our organization is doing, that's shifted a lot, I'll say, in the last year. Like a lot of organizations around the country, we had to adapt to COVID-19, and we had to become creative and thoughtful and really engage deeply with the community around what those immediate needs were. So I would say right now that's really core to our work. And we were calling it mutual aid for a long time. I think people will be excited to hear me say in this forum, because we did some work on this, that folks have decided to call this work the Queen Nanny Freedom Lab, and people were really excited about recognizing Queen Nanny, who's an important figure in Jamaican history. And so we were just, you know, it's the kind of work that is really dedicated towards moving resources to people on the ground, but at the same time asking the question of why those resources aren't already there. So, you know, to kind of like add some context to this as well, like I was stressing a little bit about what to wear today, but I got my Cancel Rant CT sweatshirt in the mail. And so I was like, well, that's one decision made for me. This is one of the big things that's come out of our mutual aid work, is hearing from our community members that they cannot pay their rent for understandable reasons. What happened last year was something nobody could have possibly prepared for. And we've seen the impact from the first days of that. And we've seen how little support people have gotten from the federal government, from the state government, from local governments. And now there's a national moratorium. There's a moratorium the governor of Connecticut has been extending, but really on a month-by-month basis. So if you can imagine the stress, the unnecessary stress that puts families under, to have to wonder if they're going to get evicted. But still, landlords are getting around it more and more, and people are starting to be evicted. So this is another part of our work, as well as we're calling for rent in Connecticut to be canceled. We're calling for housing to be recognized in the state as a human right. And that's from our folks who are facing eviction to our folks who are struggling with homelessness, something that should have never been the case. But given the realities of COVID, I think it's really, it's outrageous how little has been done to protect the most vulnerable people in our state. So I think that's some description of like our work generally, where we've been doing. I guess I can talk more about that as well. To answer your question about how the support from the foundation comes down to us, I would answer that, I think, by saying that I think the support that we get from an organization like the Movement for Black Lives really pre-exists that funding relationship. And I think it's great and long overdue that those resources are being sent to this national organization, that resources are coming more to grassroots groups and groups like ours in the state. But it's not so much that, I remember learning something in some trainings that we've done about like how resources tend to follow social movement. It's usually the work happens and then the resources come in. And so that's really, you know, we've had an opportunity to engage with the Movement for Black Lives quite a bit over the last few years, especially. We've been deeply inspired by their work. I really admire how much they show how much they're inspired by the work that groups like ours do on the ground. So I would say there are so many ways, so much that we can learn, so many ways that we can strategize and build this work broader than what we can individually as local organizations. And I think it's great. And I think I'm looking forward to seeing what having more resources given to that will make possible as well.
Karissa, I'm wondering if you could quickly talk about some of those connections that you make with groups like Camelle's across the country, how some of the work that you're doing impacts and affects the work that they're doing on the ground.
Yes, I think it's interesting because it's a little hard to talk about our work in terms of national versus local, because we really are made up of local organizations across the country. And so those organizations are driving the strategy. They are the places that we move our resources to support. So as an example, this summer we worked with 20 organizations across the country this summer and this fall to be able to provide resources for them to bring on fellows and interns that would allow them to take some of the energy from the streets around the protests and to turn that into campaigns around defunding. One organization, for instance, is formation is Defund CPD, the band network that blossomed out of the uprisings in Chicago. And so it's an opportunity for us to just lean in with these organizations. But again, they're the ones who make up who we are. Our leadership body is made up of grassroots organizations across the country. And those are the folks that are driving that work. I brought up CPD, Defund CPD, because it's on my heart that article just came out and when you were speaking about housing and COVID, and I think this just speaks to all of the connections that we see. They were given $603 million for COVID relief in Chicago. The mayor distributed 65% of that to the police department. So over 200 million of that 600 million went to the police department. Only 18 million went to the Department of Public Health. Only $2,000 went to the Office for People with Disabilities. And so when we're talking about housing, these are the connections that we're trying to make, and we're trying to tell a collective story nationally, because what is happening in Connecticut can't be seen in a vacuum from what is happening in all of these other places across the country.
Absolutely. I will say, and maybe let's stick with this theme a little bit, because Camelle, you bring up the work that needs to be done on the ground right now around COVID relief. So many people, so many families are struggling. David, I just want to quickly ask you about this. We have, in a very similar way to what Karissa just said, we have heard an awful lot about federal dollars coming into Connecticut, money that's being spent by the state. A lot of people are wishing that the money was being spent quite a bit differently. When it comes to housing relief that Camelle was talking about, the state said, hey, look at what we did. We spent $40 million to help people get rent relief. And that was maybe a quarter of what was needed at the time. And that was months ago, as people were facing pressure from rent. I guess I'm wondering, David, you've been very involved in Connecticut on a lot of different levels. What do you think needs to change about the leadership of the state and the way that we think about some of these issues? Because just like we heard in Chicago, a lot of these same things happen in Connecticut. The dollars that flow don't necessarily flow to the people who need them.
Well, part of the problem is that the leadership is not reflective of the communities, and definitely does not reflect the communities that are most in need. And part of what we have tried to support is those communities having the resources to lift their voices and to really push their way into these conversations, because that's really how it has to happen. Too many of these communities are left out, not invited into the conversations. And so, you have to make it an affirmative kind of push to get people into the conversation, and make it so that it's a much more representative discussion, which it is not, and that's a big part of the problem. And Connecticut, probably more so than other places, tends to be a place where you have to follow the money to understand why decisions are being made, because you have such extreme disparities of wealth and poverty.
Extreme disparities indeed. And you were nodding your head, Camelle, as I was talking about that. That's a big part of what the problem is right now. The state has just not done very much to help people who are in need right now, especially people who have serious needs making rent this year, not just so far during the pandemic, but throughout the course of this upcoming 2021.
Right. And I think it's a great deal more dire and outrageous than it even seems. Like our cancel rent campaign followed up on some federal dollars that were sent to the state that were supposed to go to tenants, and found that only, I believe, 2 families were assisted with those funds. So, you know, it's not so different from what you see in Chicago. We look at what happened in a place like Texas and how much people are suffering down there. And, you know, I think people up here can tend to be like, oh, it's a good thing we live in a blue state, but we're not taking better care of our people here either. We have people out on the street in the cold, and that's not just this year, that's every year. And so, you know, I think when it really does come down to us seeing housing as a human right, and not just, I think when it comes to our mutual aid work, and I want to also shout out, there's so many mutual aid efforts happening around the state that people can support. There's mutual aid, there's SOS Hartford, mutual aid Bridgeport. There are folks at Middletown Racial Justice Coalition who've been doing direct support to community members, as well as our efforts in New Haven. And, you know, that work is something that we're all really thinking of as urgent for what's happening now, but something that has to continue. So we really have to be thinking about the immediate needs of community members. And in addition to us doing that work, we have to be holding these elected officials' feet to the fire as well, because they have a responsibility.
Karissa, how much has the COVID crisis thrown a light on some of these disparities that we obviously know are there, but just seem to be in so much starker relief right now? It's just so very clear that Black Americans are affected much more deeply, both on a medical level, on a financial level, on so many levels by this crisis. It's something that obviously you've known for quite some time, but it seems as though we're really faced with this gigantic problem right now.
Yeah, I think, you know, it is another, it's another condition that has exemplified, as exactly as you've known, what we have historically known, that Black folks disproportionately are impacted by all of these systems, right? And, you know, I do believe that though the murder of George Floyd was a catalyst, it was also because we were in a pandemic. It was also because we had an inept federal government that was, you know, exhibiting proto-fascist tendencies. It's also because the billionaire class made $1 trillion during the initial months of COVID, when folks were not able to pay their bills, were not able to put food on their tables. And so all of that did what there was a light shined on it. And I think, you know, movements ebb and flow. You know, the Occupy was a moment where folks were calling to question the role of class in the makeup of our society. And unfortunately, this came with deadly consequences for our communities, specifically Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks. And until we get to start to address some of the root causes, there will be another blip. There will be another instance that brings us all back to the streets. That's like, damn, here it is again. And so it really, you know, is important for us and organizers like Camelle, who are thinking about how are we organizing around root causes that are no longer putting Band-Aids on gaping wounds.
Those root causes, though, David, I mean, you talked about Connecticut. I've been covering Connecticut for 30 years almost. And the fact is that what you said, if people start talking about money, then people will listen, right? And we always seem to be having the same conversations, but we have this gigantic wealth gap. And Karissa just said it. The billionaires across America did very well during this pandemic, as a whole lot of people were suffering. You know the political landscape of Connecticut pretty well, David. I mean, how do we get across that? I mean, right now we have a governor who is reticent to raise taxes on the billionaires in the state in order to pay for some of the things that people say need to be done right now. It's a big gap to be closed here politically in the state when we start talking about this stuff.
Well, I mean, ultimately, the people who are suffering the most have to be heard. You know, the problem is that you have not had these communities, you know, represented in the policy discussions, which is why you have school financing formulas that are so skewed, you know, where you have these wealthy school districts that can, in some instances, allocate twice as much money per student as urban school districts, can, and even some of the poor rural school districts in this state, because those voices are not included in the conversations when it comes time to make decisions about how resources get allocated. And that's why, as much as education is a focus of ours, we understand that the problem is more who's a part of the conversation. A school to prison pipeline does not get constructed when poor communities are included in the conversation, because they're not going to want that to happen. That's not what low-income parents want to have happen to their children. But when you're not in the conversation, then the school to prison pipeline flows as well as it does here in the state of Connecticut, as well as in the United States.
How do you get people involved more in that conversation?
Well, I mean, I think it's, people like CT Core who are creating the context for people to have voice, to get organized, and to understand how to access the levers of power. Because, you don't just wake up in the morning and do that, off the top of your head. That takes planning, that takes effort, that takes vision. And so leaders like Camelle and movements, like the Movement for Black Lives, creates the context within which people can step up and really access the opportunity to have voice and to engage in the process of making decisions about what happens in our state.
Camelle, can you pick up on that a little bit more and talk about how exactly that gets done? Because it does seem like an uphill climb in a state like Connecticut, where so many people's voices seem to be much quieter in the public dialogue than some of the louder voices that come with corporate concerns, big businesses, or have political capital at the Capitol.
Yeah, I mean, I think as organizers, there's lots of different ways. I can think of a lot of different strategies that we would want to consider, in addition to, direct action, organizing, continuing the kind of energy we see in the streets in these uprisings, directly confronting power, and also political strategy, right? And I just, like, as I was listening to what we're talking about, I'm thinking about Georgia, and a lot of people in Connecticut don't necessarily think about, like, why would we need strategies like that here? We're a blue state. But what does that actually amount to in terms of policy? When in a lot of places we have a single party dominating the dialogue and not a lot of back and forth. And so we do need to actually have the same kind of political power shifts that here in our elections that we saw in Georgia. The strategy would probably look somewhat different. But I've heard a lot of people talking about, like the suburbs versus the cities, right? And when it comes to policing, right, our cities are policed according to the prejudices and fears of the suburbs, right? So how do we shift that power dynamic away from those folks, away from the billionaire class here in Connecticut? A lot of those billionaires that cleaned up during the early days of this pandemic live right here in this state. So, and even just exposing that, having people talk about that, having more people understand that. I think it's possible. I think what I really appreciated about that strategy, what we saw in Georgia, what we saw through those coalitions, was that there was a lot of emphasis on people who don't vote and a lot of emphasis on registering people to vote. And so I'm interested in seeing what those kinds of strategies could do in a place like Connecticut, as well as, your direct action strategies.
Go ahead, Karissa.
Yeah. Just to build on that, I'm pretty inspired by what happened in Missouri, in the St. Louis area. And so many folks may now know Cori Bush, who is joining the squad as part of that progressive group. And I would argue that Cori Bush is probably the most radical, one of the most radical members of the squad. And she unseated a second generation Democratic dynasty. And so that, even as you're naming, Camelle, even in blue states, there's some real opportunity for us to shift away from what has been considered business as usual, to putting people in positions of power who are aligned with our movements. I still think that movement has a lot of work to do in terms of holding folks accountable when they're in office. It's something that movements have struggled with historically, but I think that there is a turning of the tides in terms of folks, many people in mass movements who have not utilized the electoral strategy as part of their organizing component, who are now seeing the value and inside of that strategy. And, you know, it can never be divorced from our other work around direct action organizing. Also really excited for folks to be building alternatives. There's a small grassroots group in Sacramento called the Anti-Police Terror Project, and they just launched a program called MH First, which is a rapid response to people with mental health disabilities or in mental health crises that is not dependent on the police. And so, you know, we have to be utilizing all of the tools in our toolbox. Some of those are going to be electoral, some of those are going to be direct action organizing, some of those are going to be building thriving alternatives that our folks really see dignity and their ability to thrive inside of.
And David, quickly, when it comes to political organizing, this is something that, you know, the Graustein Fund hasn't necessarily gotten involved with in this particular way, but this is a part of this conversation.
Well, no, we don't feel it's our place to sort of inject ourselves into political organizing. We really think it's more important to make it possible for communities to decide what strategies they want to pursue. You know, the thing I think it's important for philanthropy in particular to remember, you know, as much as, you know, different foundations want to focus on different issues like housing or education or criminal justice, you know, the first offense was taking away the autonomy and the voice of peoples, first the indigenous peoples and then the African peoples that were brought to this country. And it's important for philanthropy and everyone to support, if we say that we are a democracy and we care about democracy, that we support the ability of communities to have voice, to be able to be a part of the decision-making process, to decide what happens to them, their families, and their communities. And so we don't necessarily feel the need to inject ourselves into the political organizing process as much as we feel it's our responsibility to support communities and being able to do that, whether it's a focus on education or any other issue.
We've got a couple of good questions coming in from people. I want to get to one here. Albert asks, in Connecticut, as all over the country, we'll be drawing new district lines. How can we make sure that the communities that you've been talking about have their voices heard in redistricting? Anybody want to take that?
Well, I would say it is very timely. It's not my issue per se, but again, redistricting is one of the places where communities really get cut out of the process. And so it's so important for you know, Black communities in particular who tend to suffer the most to be a part of and equipped to engage in the process and to be able to push back against all the various things that happen. You know, gerrymandering was not something that was created by the Black community. The redistricting process has been one of the ways in which the African American and communities of color have been undercut for generations.
Camelle, did you want to pick up?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think, you know, anybody that's doing organizing around the state of Connecticut, especially organizing with Black folks and people of color, you know, if you can find out where these conversations are being had and be attending those meetings. I know our folks are pretty serious. Tonight, a group of our folks went to a meeting about a change that's happening in New Haven, right? Because, you know, they sense they smell gentrification, right? So they want to be at that table. So I think it's really important to be aware of those kinds of meetings when they're happening and to be present for them and to be strategizing around, you know, who are the people that are in power in those conversations, what's on the table, how can we make sure that we're being heard and that we're pushing and making sure that what we want to see happens. Yeah, it's always available for folks.
Yeah, no, the only thing that I would add really quickly is we also have to be very clear about what is considered a free and fair election. And even if you're not in an area that is being challenged by redistricting, we all have a responsibility to call it out. The level of voter suppression that is connected to redistricting, et cetera, is astronomical, to a point where we will no longer be able to say that this is you know, yeah, I think folks already question whether we have free and fair elections because of the level of voter suppression. And so the invitation is for folks to speak up about you know, voter suppression, even if it's not happening, even if you don't see it in your own communities. Guarantee you find a Black community somewhere near you and it's happening there.
Margaret has a question that I think comes up a lot, and I'll put it to you first, Karissa, but I think everyone can chime in here. When you talk about defunding the police, she writes, do you mean completely doing away with the police or redirecting some portion of police funds to better human services?
So I think many people have different definitions of what they mean when they say defunding. To be totally frank, the Movement for Black Lives is an abolitionist organization. We do not believe that policing and the liberation of Black people can coexist. We were, as Black people, the first thing that folks were policing, our bodies. And so we see it as a responsible process towards abolition. And abolition is not just the tearing down of something, it is the building of something new. And so we want our folks to be safe. Black folks want to have safe communities. We want to have communities where people are not being harmed, et cetera. And we want to think really creatively about other ways to do that, that don't rely on militarized forces in our communities with very bad track records for keeping us safe.
To talk more about that, I mean, what does it look like if we imagine a future with a better something that takes the place of what police are right now?
Well, I think it is twofold. When we talk about defunding, we also talk about investments, because we have to create the conditions where we're mitigating the cause for crime. And that is connected to economics. It's connected to housing. It's connected to food and water. So we have to invest in ways that allow our folks to really have what they need. When I heard someone say, when we talk about defunding, we're talking about police levels in white communities, right? In white communities, you don't have the police running down the street, all of these things. And it's because those communities often have the material needs that they do. So that's a piece of it. And it's a really huge piece of it around creating the investments in our communities. The other piece is thinking about all of the ways, all of the tools in our communities that can be brought forward in lieu of armed police response, right? And that looks like people who are trained mental health counselors responding to mental health crises. That looks like non-armed people who are checking folks for running a red light, or just red light cameras, which have also been found to be, another effective tool. And so, we have put a person on the moon. And so I do believe in my heart that if we put our brains and, more importantly, our hearts together, we can think about solutions that really sees the full dignity in all of our folks.
Camelle, I'd love your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add. Like, I would say we agree with that. Defund as a means to abolish wholeheartedly. And at the bottom line, police have not always existed. They do not need to exist. We have seen what they do when they do exist. And we've seen it here in Connecticut. I know a lot of folks who may be listening or watching today have stories that they can tell about interactions that they've had. I've had friends be harmed by the police for simply being outside protesting, being outside minding their business, being the wrong color in the wrong neighborhood here in the state. I think we've seen fairly well how deeply white supremacy and racism and violence is woven into the culture of policing. And that even when police officers are doing their job to the letter, to the book, they're not physically violent, that those policies are still harming our communities. So I agree. I think we can do better. And I think that we have so many brilliant minds already thinking about this, already doing this work in other parts of the country and right here in Connecticut.
If however, though, abolition is the goal, and I think we all on this call, everyone who's listening in knows that is probably not the likely outcome anytime soon. What's an interim step? Like, what do you see as success, Camelle, in trying to change police culture, specifically as it revolves around policing Black people in Connecticut cities? If we fall short of what you're going for, what's a good step to take?
I don't know if I would call this changing police culture, but I would say getting police out of our schools is a good step. I would say removing police entirely from schools and replacing that police presence with the presence of counselors and other services that young people actually need. And I would say, removing resources from overinflated police budgets and putting it into those investments that Karissa is mentioning, support for mental health services. I don't know if anybody listening has had somebody in their family deal with a mental health crisis. I know I have. When things get bad, there's no one to call, right? There's no one to call but the police. So I think those are the steps, right? Creating those alternatives for people to actually get the help that they need. I've done a lot of work on police reform and work around anti-police brutality work. And the more money that goes into trainings and the kinds of things that people say, changes police culture, we don't see any cultural changes. We don't see material changes to how people are actually being treated. We just see more resources going into the police department.
David, I'm wondering if you can pick up on that, especially, because you've been so involved in education. This idea of police in the schools is a huge one, and it's a very problematic one in a lot of places.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the more absurd things that ever was thought of, frankly, that somehow putting police in schools would make them a better place for young people to grow and develop. That's just, not just as a foundation executive, as a parent, as a human being, it made absolutely no sense. And that would certainly be a good place to start, is to begin reversing that kind of a process. And frankly, going back to the idea of, listening to the parents and the community about what, how they want those schools to function. That was clearly not something that was coming from the community as a way to, make those children safer and to make them have an environment within which they could learn and grow.
David, maybe I'll stay with you for this next question here. We got one coming in from Adam about what needs to be done about black men in criminal justice. It's not just obviously a Connecticut problem. We have a large overrepresentation of young black men in Connecticut's jails and prisons. It's something that has been addressed somewhat by the last few administrations in the state, where we have had quite a bit of decarceration relative to other states, but it's still a problem that overwhelmingly affects black men. What do you see as a strategy here to get at that particular issue holistically?
So I think the problem is that the decarceration that has begun to happen has been focused more on figuring out ways to save the state money. And that's not really where we should be going with that. The school to prison pipeline is a reflection of a skewed investment strategy. And, frankly, to the extent to which there are those savings, they should be poured back into the community, back into the schools, and into figuring out how do you support and lift up communities that have both had extreme barriers forever and have had the fewest opportunities and resources. One of the things that does not get addressed is, not only do you spend way too much money in one space like criminal justice and certainly not enough in education, even once you get through the educational system in this country as a person of color, and especially as a Black person, you still do not have the same opportunities. Your degree does not have the same values. Studies have been shown that you can have a college degree as a Black person and no criminal record and still have less opportunities than a white high school graduate with a criminal record. So yes, we have to do something about the way in which we invest our resources so that we are investing in the success of young Black men and women from beginning to end. And now that we've created this problem, we have to invest in the reentry process and making it not just that you're just putting people back on the street, you're giving people real opportunities to turn their lives around and to grow and fulfill their potential. And really look at how racist this society still is. I think the real silver lining of this last year is it's getting harder and harder for anybody to deny that we are still a race-based society. We have been from the beginning, we continue to be, and it's something that has to be undone.
Karissa, I'd love to hear from you more on that, because I wanted to talk about the idea of anti-racism work across all the work that you do, across the work that a lot of us need to do. But David raises something that's, of course, very important. We're a racist society. We don't talk about it enough. We've come to grips with it a little bit this year, but it seems to be something that will fade once again after some of the activity in the streets fades a little bit. Maybe you can talk about that and what it means to do anti-racist work.
Yeah, when we think about the work that we do explicitly anti-Black racist work. And, you know, there are a lot of really amazing programs that are working with folks interpersonally, like the Ann Braden program that's working specifically with white folks who want to move towards an anti-racist politic. But most of our work focuses on systems, right? And we know that systemic anti-Black racism is prevalent in every single system, from the health field that says that Black people feel less pain, to the criminal justice system, as Adam lifted up the disparities in terms of the Black population and those who are incarcerated, education, as David was just speaking to. And so that's the work that we really root ourselves in, is looking at systems of oppression that are governing our lives and being deeply harmful. And, you know, it's long-term work. We are not the first movement to want to talk about police brutality. I'm from Oakland, California, and, you know, the legacy of the Black Panthers sits pretty squarely in my spirit. And, you know, if you look at their 10-point platform, it could be written today. We want fair housing, fit for a human. We want food, shelter. You know, we want to end to police brutality. It literally could have been written today. And, you know, that's just going back one generation. We can go back so many more. So, you know, we're in a long lineage of folks who are inside of this work around anti-Black racism. And the thing that's important to us is that we continue to center on systems. There are other organizations that we think are doing really great jobs around that interpersonal stuff, though.
Yeah. Camelle, do you have thoughts on this idea of what anti-racist work is not only for your organization, but for others as well, for others who are maybe listening right now who don't take part in anti-racist work on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think I would say something similar too. I think our focus has really been on, you know, like I said, meeting people's needs. And also when we think about like how we talk about racism and how we talk about how we understand where we are in this moment in history, we're doing a lot of political education work ourselves and reading together and engaging with what our ancestors thought and said about you know, where we are and where we're going and where we should be going, and about what people who are doing this work today are thinking. So in terms of the anti-racism work, some of our folks have attended those trainings and have participated in that work. And I agree, like I think it can be really meaningful for folks. It hasn't particularly been my focus. And I think part of what made that shift for me, and I'll say this for me personally, is as an organizer, was reading Stokely Carmichael. And Stokely Carmichael has a quote that says, if a white man wants to kill me, that's his problem. If he has the power to kill me, that's my problem. And I think that really undergirds like a lot of the way that I approach this work as well, is that there's something to be said for work that brings people together and gets people talking to each other. But if at the end of that, what we have are a more benevolent group of mostly white, wealthy people in charge of us, that's not the freedom future I'm imagining, right? It's freedom, right? And that I think requires really focusing on systems.
That's a really important thing you just said. And I think it probably resonates interestingly with a lot of people a lot of white people, frankly, who've spent a lot of time this year thinking about how they can have deep conversations about this and how they can do the work as allies. But what you just said is a very true thing. The systems need to change if you're actually going to talk about a type of freedom that you envision, that you deserve.
And this shouldn't involve anybody from awkward dinner table conversations. but yeah.
We're going to have plenty of those too. Anderson asks, what policies is CT Core prioritizing during this legislative session? Do you have things that you're thinking about for the Connecticut legislative session, Camelle?
We're starting to talk about that. We've been really in a rebuilding phase. So we've got some announcements coming up soon about how we're re-envisioning our work. So look out for that. In terms of policy right now, our main focus is cancel rent CT, getting people, keeping people in their homes, getting more people into safe housing. That's really it for us right now. But as we grow, I think that's going to be increasingly a part of our work as we continue to move forward.
Yeah, I just got a note here from our reporter, Jackie Thomas, who covers housing in the state. She said 37 people were evicted just last week. And only 30 of the $40 million that I talked about that was earmarked for rental assistance was even spent. So if the $40 million that was earmarked by the state was far too little to have dealt with the problem, only $30 million was actually spent to help people. And we do have people getting evicted.
I want to mention that like one of the main things that Cancel Rent has been pushing for as well is changing, because one of the things that's making the resources, making it hard for the resources to move is that all of the onus is being put on renters to fill out the forms and jump through all these hoops. We have asked for that to actually be shifted so that it's landlords that are applying for that money. And the landlords are getting the rent money that they need to pay their mortgage or what have you. And rent is just canceled for tenants, and that burden is taken off of them. And that also will address a lot of equity issues about who is able to access that money and who isn't. So I wanted to say that that's really important. And I also wanted to mention earlier, I didn't get to say when I was talking about taking police out of schools. If folks want to be working on that, the Black and Brown Student Union and Citywide Youth Coalition are two organizations, also Hearing Youth Voices, which is in New London. Those are three organizations that you can look into and support by donating, by getting involved. These are youth-led initiatives that are working to remove police from schools in Connecticut.
Sharon asks a question here about, do you know if Black people are being informed about absentee voting without an excuse and early voting legislation in the Connecticut legislature? If so, are they being encouraged to urge their rep and senator to vote yes for these bills? As we were talking about some of the political organizing that could be happening at the state capitol this year, David, this is something that people in the state have been talking about for a long time. It's very hard to actually vote in any way other than to go to the polls on election day. Because of COVID, this was the first time that we ever had an ability to really broadly vote in Connecticut by absentee ballot. And it was a resounding success. Not surprisingly, a lot more people voted than ever voted before. It's something that the legislature wants to raise, and it's something that seemingly could substantively influence the fortunes of Black Connecticut residents.
Yes, and part of the problem, yes, you have barriers to voting, but you have barriers to participating in government all the way around. I saw a question about how do you get more people of color involved in boards of ed. You have to look at the culture and the practices of those boards of ed. When my kids were in high school and I wanted to be an involved parent, and I got there and it was clear that the process was rigged, and they only wanted me there just to keep the seat warm. They did not want my voice. They did not want my vote. And so most people, when they go into those environments and they see how it operates, they figure, well, why bother? If you're going to throw all these obstacles in the way of voting, of being a part of the school boards, of being a part of any of the aspects of policy making and policy execution. And so we have to get those barriers out of the way. We have to make it, government has to be user friendly. It has to be something that citizens can actively engage in on a regular basis without it being a hassle.
We just have a couple minutes left. I did get a question from somebody for you, David. Do you expect or hope that the contribution that Graustein made for Moving for Black Lives is something that will prompt other foundations to follow in your steps?
It's not so much a hope. We've been actively engaged in dialogue with our peers in philanthropy to really begin to create a different conversation that's a part of a national conversation. And we wanted it to happen in Connecticut as well. And so, yes, we certainly welcome people in philanthropy stepping forward and supporting the kinds of people, like CT Corps and the organizations that she just mentioned, because they are changing the atmosphere and the context of how these issues are being addressed. And that's very important. But yes, we don't just hope, we have actively reached out to our peers.
I have an important question, I think, as we close up for both Karissa and Camelle. And you were talking, Karissa, earlier about, Movement for Black Lives being mobilized originally around the events of Ferguson and picking up so much steam over the course of this last year. Of course, we don't want to think about this important work gaining steam because of tragic, horrible events that shouldn't happen. But you both know far better than I do that often outrage over terrible things happening is what galvanizes people sometimes to go to the street. So I'm wondering, Karissa, how you think about, as you make these systems better over time and as you have the success that you want to have, how do you also keep the momentum going, right? If things are getting better, there is potentially less of the outrage that drives people to what we saw during the course of this last year. But you need to continue that momentum. So talk about that, about building something that goes past a time that we're in seemingly right now.
Yeah, I think as long as the systems of oppression that currently govern our lives are intact, folks will become enraged. I was politicized during the uprisings around justice for Oscar Grant, who was murdered in Oakland by our transit police. And I remember pretty starkly, like, I have a Black president, and a Black man just got shot in his back while his hands were cuffed behind his back. And there has been no accountability for anyone. And so unfortunately, those flashpoints do galvanize us. But what I hope we're able to organize folks around, and what I hope will bring excitement, is when we're putting our heads together thinking about alternatives, when we're putting our heads together thinking about the new systems that we're going to collectively build that will really allow our folks, as I named earlier, to thrive. And so, yeah, we're going to continue to be inside of this dance of how to respond rapidly and how to put forward really visionary ideas that hopefully will galvanize folks all the same.
Mel, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I think that's really the work of building a movement, is, finding those people who are newly engaged and newly excited about being a part of this work, and supporting and facilitating their continued participation in that movement, their growth in that movement, their ability to become leaders in that movement. I want to take this moment to just also lift up something that I've been wanting to lift up, which is this brilliant video that the Movement for Black Lives put out for Black Futures Month, on with the beach and the time capsule. I heard you were behind that, Karissa, and I cried so hard when I was watching it, because it really emphasizes something that I think a lot of us hold in our heart as movement builders and organizers, which is that this is a generational movement. And we're doing this for the people who are going to come after us. We're doing this for the people, our children and our children's children, our children's children's children. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that as well, Karissa, and encourage everybody to go and find it and watch it.
Thank you very much for that. And I also wanted to let everyone know who took part in tonight's event that this event will be captured on YouTube and on our website. It's ctmirror.org/events, so that you can take a look at it later. Please feel free to share it widely, and you can continue the conversation there. You can continue to send us your ideas at ctmirror.org. I want to thank Camelle and Karissa and David. I want to thank our interpreters, Lily and Shanice, for their work tonight. I definitely want to thank Kyle Constable and Bruce Putterman at the Connecticut Mirror, and also Janae Woods from Graustein, who did so much work for us for this event tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. It really was very important. It was great to see you all in person. Hope we can all get together in real life at some point soon. Be well. Please have a good evening.